Well, good morning. Welcome from here in London, and welcome to our panelists, Paul, Michael, and Rebecca. We're here to discuss with Citiform Crumbling Capital, Fragile Public Spending Foundations Need Rethinking. It should be an exciting event, and we've got some very famous authors. As you know, we don't bother to introduce people. You've already read their biographies two or three times, but we do like to introduce our sponsors, and we would like to thank our sponsors most copiously because without them, we would be unable to present this series of webinars. And also thanks to our partner, City Forum, with whom we've cooperated many times. Now, a few words of housekeeping before we begin. One, yes, this is being recorded. Two, the recording will be available hopefully in a day or two on the same URL that you had, but do feel free to email us if you have any problems after 48 hours. The panelists here are going to be speaking in a round robin sense. We have a couple of questions for them as a panel, and then we're going to be turning over to you. So the success of this webinar very much depends on those of you who are out there in the question and answers. There are, in fact, a large number of people online, as I can see. So please do try and get your questions, comments, or observations in early so that we're able to handle them as much as possible. Um, I was just going to produce a few opening remarks merely because this subject is dear to my heart. Back 18 years ago in 2007, I gave a lecture which was entitled, quite interestingly, Stealing the Silver, How We Take from the Dispossessed, the Poor, and Our Own Children. And in order to examine that theft more closely, I looked at the Victorian era, sort of a paraphrase of Life of Brian film joke, what have the Victorians ever done for us? And all around the UK, we find ourselves relying on Victorian infrastructure for water, sewage, roads, ports, railways. In London, more than half the water mains are more than 100 years old, and around a third are over 150 years old. So, what's been going on the past century? Well, in fact, Thames Water, the London Water Company, even implies that the Victorians are at fault. They have signs up there, London's Victoria Water Works need to be modernized. You're like, well, you've had them for over a century. What are you doing with it? Now, water supplies may seem boring, but don't forget that sewage and clean water are actually all that separate us from cholera and typhoid. So in that lecture, I postulated 7 ways in which we steal from subsequent generations. And they were regressive taxation, waste that wasn't being handled properly, biased social services, subsidies, lack of competition, under-provisioning, and externalities. Now, that's quite theoretical, but I think we'll be touching on many of those today. And I'm extraordinarily pleased to have our audience, to have our panel here today, uh, all of whom I know, and I'm very pleased that they've taken the time to make comments. So if we could, we'll start with you, Rebecca. What would you like to convey about our crumbling problems?
So, thank you very much, and it's a huge privilege to be here today. I think very simply, I'm going to make 3 points, and these will need unpacking, I can promise you. But we are in an environment where economic security is more important and critical than economic growth. And that's a very controversial statement, but the reason why I'm saying it is because the global economy is at effectively economic war. What that means is that we have a systemic crisis going on. We are not just using economic statecraft, sanctions, export controls, and so on to fight our wars against Russia and to constrain Iran and so on. We're actually fighting an economic war where the fabric of our free market economy is actually being undermined by great power competition. What do I mean by that? The big institutions of trade, of economics are being undermined. And I mean the World Trade Organization, I mean the International Monetary Fund, I mean the World Bank. And this is happening from all great powers, from the BRICS nations and from the United States. So it means that we have to think again about economic security. And that gives us a huge opportunity because if we are staying with the constraints and the theories that we have economically over the last 80 years, then we actually have very weak power levers. We aren't able to borrow at the moment. We aren't able to increase budgets at the moment. We have to think of new ways of doing this. If we start talking about economic security and acknowledging the fact that there is an economic conflict that's going on, then we can start to release funding. We can start to look at economic warfare and the ways in which we use our economic power levers, the financial centre of the world effectively, or certainly trade in London. We have levers that we can also use because of our power in trade finance. All of these things, a very strong financial services sector that we have, mean that we can use those power levers in order to influence as well as in order to protect ourselves as a deterrent, if you like. What do we need to do that? Our institutions need to be agile. They need to be flexible in the same way that our military responses need to be. And we need to be able to adjust and face those economic threats, identify economic threats as they come in. So actually what we need is a more agile way of running our economy, greater involvement of the private sector, and perhaps a new way of thinking about how we raise money. If we're talking about economic security, then how about security bonds? Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was excellent. Paul, your tuppence.
So I thought I'd focus on the relationship between national security and capital. If we roll back the clock to 2021 and the integrated review, we talked a lot at the time around the absolute essential bond between national security, indeed economic security, as Rebecca noted, and technology, R&D, those sorts of investments. In 2021, we talked a lot about how we needed to increase the amount of research and development across the UK. We talked about the need to have strategic advantage in key technologies and about innovation. We set around a set of reforms across the national security and defence community on the back of that. I think along the way we learned something, which was on its own those interventions weren't sufficient. We began to see that the availability of capital was essential from a variety of prisms, whether it be in terms of small and medium-sized enterprises growing, companies when they're reaching that Series B plus, you'll be familiar with, Michael, looking to stay in the UK and accelerate their growth. Or indeed from a regional perspective, how do we build really powerful ecosystems with available capital able to grow and deliver the technologies and capabilities we needed? Some of our responses along the way included the growth of the National Security Strategic Investment Fund, NSIF, which has done a great job not only in delivering capabilities for the community, but also crowding capital. Or the NATO Innovation Fund, again, a response to that at a NATO level. Fast forward today, and if you were to look at within the Strategic Defence Review or the National Security Strategy or the Industrial Strategy, you'll see a really common thread. That's not just about the need for R&D and the 86 billion that will be going into that, but it's also about how capital is that vital strategic pillar for national security. This is a tool, a part of our arsenal, keeping the UK safe and prosperous moving forwards. I think some of the questions will be really interesting to explore as we go through the session today are how do we make national security and defence an ever more attractive proposition for investors? How do we encourage people to bring their scarce capital into our sorts of challenges? How do we reduce the cost of capital for the private sector firms and partners we depend upon for our capabilities and security? And lastly, accepting the UK as a medium-sized but global player, how do we increase our ability to pool capital with allies, bringing together on the most major and critical projects? All those are great challenges, and I think the audience today would have some very valuable views in how we might achieve that.
Thank you so much. Michael, of course, you've written a book on the subject, so very curious about your thoughts.
Good morning, Michael. Thanks for having me. Good morning to the other speakers and everyone on the line. So I'll just start with a strap line from the book, which is that globalization as we know it or knew it is over, and that's manifestly clear. What's not so clear, I think, is what's going to come after globalization. There's a sense that we're now in an interregnum period, to use that lovely phrase from the 17th century, where some countries like the US are trying to reshape the world order. New security threats are beginning to emerge. So it's a very noisy, nasty, a nastier world environment. Globalization, recall, was characterized by no inflation, no major wars, and now we have lots of those. my thesis is that until we get to the end point in the sort of the firm new world order, we have to overcome at least three hurdles. So one is climate damage, another is a crisis of democracy, and then related to that is a debt crisis. And interestingly enough, the major economies of the world had never been as indebted at the same time. China, depending on the metrics you use, has got debt to GDP of 200-300%. Same for Japan. Britain and France have got debt to GDP of 100%. And following the big, beautiful bill, the US is on course for debt to GDP of 125% in the next 10 years or so. So balance sheets of governments are absolutely loaded. The corporate sector, I would say, is in much better shape or fettle, and maybe that's where the solution lies. Just to give you a brief history lesson, I think the UK is in a very difficult but interesting place because the government has got to do four things at the same time: reduce debt, reduce the deficit, rebuild productivity, which is proving very hard to do, and then to both Rebecca and Paul's point, fight a quasi-war or security crisis. And doing one of those is hard. Doing four at the same time is a huge task. The UK, I think, is interesting in terms of its economic history because it's very long. And for those economic history geeks amongst you, the Office for Budget Responsibility has got a note on 300 years of UK public finances. And if you look at that, what's interesting is that war and security and debt are intermingled. So from 1700 to 1800, debt to GDP in the UK rose from 25 to nearly 200%, as Britain rather engaged in five major wars right up to the Napoleonic Wars, and then we have Pitt the Younger to thank for bringing in taxation, remodeling the economy, and then over the next century, debt to GDP fell from 200 to about 29% with the Crimean War and the Boer War in between. So it was a period of prosperity and fiscal strength. And then we come to the two world wars when defense spending hit over 50% of GDP, debt to GDP hit about 250%. And then the interesting thing is that today, debt to GDP in the UK and France is about 100%. We don't have a de facto war involving either country. President Macron is in London today. Security is top of the agenda. So fighting this urgent defense and security challenge with oodles of debt is going to be incredibly demanding for policymakers, and I'm glad that we're going to probe this issue on the call today.
Thank you. And actually, I think the historical perspective is important. In fact, into the chat, folks, I've placed the report by Luke Lansky and Conor O'Loughlin on 300 years of UK public finance data for you to pick up. So thanks for referencing that, Michael. And bragging rights, I will be seeing President Macron at Guildhall tonight for dinner, but I won't be able to ask him these pointed questions with 600 other people there. But anyway, we'll see what he says. Now, a couple of questions to get things going. Rebecca opened with the importance of economic security. Paul, that's obviously one of your places. Do you think this is over-egging it? Are you totally in agreement with that? What are your thoughts?
So economic security has been a core issue for us over the last few years, and you've all seen the legislation passed to try and strengthen the tools, levers we have available, and a lot of the thinking that's gone on in how national security links to economic security, links to growth. I'm very much of the view that we should be trying to provide options that give us both our cake and allow us to eat it. So I'm interested in how do we deliver that economic security whilst crowding in capital from other sources that makes good any difference. I don't think this can be a conversation simply about limiting the amount of capital reaching UK firms and UK academics to in itself. We have to find new ways to link them to trusted capital, link them to growth capital, other forms of resources to enable them to have the same or better growth than they might have had in previous periods. That's quite a clever balancing act. But if we think about it in those terms, then the UK has a whole set of levers, a whole set of relationships we can draw upon, whether it be from our Five Eyes, NATO allies, whole set of potential avenues for achieving that sort of trick on the ground. So we've been confident we can do it, but it does require us to bring together the growth agenda and the economic security agenda along with the national security agenda in ways perhaps we haven't had to do in previous decades.
What would that mean? Where are the conflicts in those two? Are they not the same thing?
So in practice, I think that means recognising that, say, the work of the Department of Business and Trade in crowding in capital from overseas sources is part of the solution we're looking at here. It's about helping colleagues in the Department of Science, Innovation, Technology, again, work where the potential investment funds can be. I think part of the role of the national security community can be to help explain what our mission is, what some of our problem books are. You've seen a lot of work going on to make that more transparent, to show where the future demand would be for some of the goods and services we need, which in turn encourages people to take forward statements on investment and bring those resources in. And then that sits alongside the economic security measures which Rebecca has been talking about. But it's bringing those together in some sort of effective sort of economic tradecraft, I might put in those terms, which allows us to avoid having to trade off against the outcomes which the public would expect us to see.
Rebecca, I should have studied Rebeccanomics 10, not Economics 10, at university. But Michael reminded us of the sweep of history and the four things the government needs to do: reduce debt, the deficit, improve productivity, and economic security. And he gave us reference to 300 years and Napoleonic and the book. Do you have a period that you would draw upon where you thought that we were in a similar situation and did a good job at getting out?
Right, I can only scare everybody if I start doing this. So I think the period of time that we're in, if you look at every single period of history and international relations, trade is at the heart of all of this. And the one thing that we haven't talked about in terms of economic security at the moment is the trade strategy, which is actually a very significant document in acknowledging the fact that economic security and trade are core to what businesses do. Right. So let's put that through history. Every single time trade has been involved with trade and economics have been involved with military, there's been conflict at the end. So you look at heightened economic conflict, it comes to conflict. I'll never forget when I was doing my PhD donkeys years ago now, Mary Kaldor standing up and saying, well, in actual fact, every single time you get these new technologies coming along, you also end up with conflict at the end of it. Well, we're seeing the same thing with economic growth. We're in a situation at the moment where there are new technologies, where we don't really know what the role of the nation state is at the moment, because we've got this huge globalization globalization has led to, and it's not my phrase, the weaponization of interdependencies. In my books, I've called it the weaponization of trade, but it's basically all of those financial networks, those technology networks. The battle for the 21st century, if you like, the great power conflict, is about control of all of that data and all of that technology. Money has effectively become data. So we have an internet of money out there. And that's one of the things that comes from blockchain, cryptocurrencies, etc. There's a huge amount of information there which states want to recapture, because at the moment, look at it from a populist point of view, people don't understand necessarily why their jobs are insecure, why their livelihoods are insecure, why they don't feel comfortable with things like climate change, why politics has lost its legitimacy. This gives rise to populism. It throws politics out to the left and to the right. It means that we start using tariffs, which we are doing. We start using instruments of power like tariffs. And this starts, if you look at the historical period that I'm now starting to refer to, where states start to use tariffs for coercive reasons, economic statecraft in that type of a sense, we're looking at the 1920s and 1930s. And that did not end well. Now, economic war does not mean necessarily that we end up with a kinetic war. But the position that we're in at the moment is very, very worrying, because we have all of these interdependencies in exactly the same way that we had back in the 1930s, so and even the 1910s. So my period of history is not a very reassuring one, I'm afraid.
Good. Well, let's turn to some of the comments from the audience. Christopher Messina, who runs something called Messy Times in America, is also somebody who's raised quite a few billion for private sector investments over the years. And his question is, he says, in a practical sense, almost all big pools of capital invest in and want someone else to make the kinds of investments we are discussing here. How do you see changing that attitude? And I'm going to turn to Michael on this one, if I may. But may I add something else in a sense, which is, one of the things I find amusing is when we're bigging ourselves up, we're the X largest economy, fifth, sixth, seventh, whatever you want to call it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we're so rich, why do we feel so poor? Where did all the money go? So what about those big pools of capital and changing the attitude that maybe it's private sector and putting its cash up?
So Mike, let me just preface the answer to the question with a few examples of other countries who are, getting it. So in Germany, we don't talk enough about the reform of the German debt brake to invest about €1 trillion in defence. In the US, what's very curious is the number 2 person in the Department of Defense is Steve Feinberg, who used to run Cerberus, which is a very big private equity company. And to my mind, that prefigures a revolution in defense innovation and private involvement in defense technology. And then, of course, in China, the state is heavily behind the private defense sector. In terms of marrying capital to some of these new areas, I mean, I think it's a relatively new departure, because 2 or 3 years ago, there were very few mainstream, even VC and private equity funds who invested in defense and even space. 2 years ago, space was very, very quirky. So I think the challenge really, in my view, there's 2 challenges. One is matching projects with investors. So what I mean by that is that many of the new defense technologies and crossover technologies are in areas like cyber, AI, that the broad swathe of VC investors find interesting in terms of the returns they can generate. And I think you will only attract VC money and private equity money for returns first, and then patriotism second. The second point then is that another chunk of defense-related investments would be in things like infrastructure, and that can span transport, energy infrastructure, and that's a different cohort of investors. It's infrastructure investors, it's potentially pension funds. So I think there needs to be a bit of matchmaking between the spectrum of projects and the types of investors. The second point I want to make, which I think is massively underestimated, I've been involved in the last couple of years in venture raises for very eclectic space investments, defense, and quantum investments. And a really big barrier is education, or is just a specialization, because there are very few, to my experience, VC managers who really understand quantum and the quantum spectrum. There are very, very few who understand things like space energy. And that's simply because these are very, very arcane areas in science. So I think to an extent, the venture and private equity industries need to equip themselves better with scientific specialists. And I also think that the scientists and the people behind the projects need to do a better job of explaining themselves and explaining the economic rents behind the various projects.
Great. Well, thank you on that one. In fact, Nikki Holtzhausen thanks you. That was effectively the answer to the question she put into the question thread. I've put in the chat room, Trevor Hilder points us all to the discipline of cliodynamics, which, for those of you not familiar, talks about the really transdisciplinary area of research combining cultural evolution, economic history, macro sociology, and mathematical modeling. So a lot of action out here, if I may. Christopher Messina and others, and I will say many others, would like to go on and discuss, in a sense, I think, cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, et cetera. I'm actually going to take it a bit further than that because I find that just to kind of, you might as well throw out quantum and blockchain and some other terminology you don't understand. The interesting thing to me is, Rebecca, you were talking about really kind of the system being on the edge of breakdown. Michael, you similarly, and the system itself might well survive. And we have seen monetary punctuations as much during these periods. So we have the Bank of England and war, we have the Napoleonic funding, fascinating period. But even in 1913, we have the Federal Reserve. So we have them coming on and off the gold standards and coming off the gold. And so there, monetary punctuations equally occur in line with various conflicts and stresses in the system, which I think was your point, Rebecca. Now, in all of this, I would anticipate governments to be doing much more. They've basically run the fiat currency to destruction. We've had a lack of controls on debt and deficit have not functioned, and every sign that they're about to blow up. Will we see a monetary transformation such as central bank digital currencies, which in many senses removes the need for stable coins, removes the need for a lot of the cryptocurrency stuff that's being talked about? And we do have a large number of CBDC experiments going on around the world. Paul.
Oh,
Rebecca, you look like you're about to leap in there. You go and I'll follow.
Rebecca, you've got it.
Well, I will say this first, and then Paul, please. But I think it's really important to go back to the point that I made, which is trade is in the middle of all of this. So when we're talking about trade finance, trade and supply chain resilience, trade finance, there are digital solutions out there. We've got the model law for electronic transferable records. We're starting to use digital documentation in trade finance transactions. Trade is actually, and trade finance is a way of leveraging in short-term working capital to solve some of these bigger resilience problems, which Paul and I have both talked about. But more importantly than this, the digitization of trade means that we are also talking about the digitization of trade finance, which means that we are also talking about the role of cryptocurrencies in those trade finance transactions, greater role of blockchain, etc. Now, one of the things that I would just point out at a very, very, very top line level, if we take that increased role of cryptocurrencies within trade, blockchains, immutable contracts, all of these types of things, and actually governments increasingly lose control of, and banks lose control of, a decentralized system because it's gone into the digital space. So if you look at what's happening in China and then look at what's happening in the United States, they are almost polar opposites of each other. China, central bank digital currency, digital payment systems, the SIP system enables digital currencies. It's disintermediating potentially the Western banking sector, but it's also disintermediating the US dollar without potentially, it's not doing it at the moment, but it has that potential. But it's doing that without actually posing a direct threat in international trade or finance to the US dollar. The US dollar is doing quite an effective job of undermining itself at the moment. So it's actually just sitting there building new technologies, and they are through central bank digital currencies. If you look at what the Trump administration is doing on the other side, and by the way, I have a book coming out on this, The World Economic War, in September, so I can bore for England on this subject. But the point is that America is actually saying we are going down Bitcoin reserve route. We're not developing a central bank digital currency. And if you look at the executive orders that President Trump has issued, they are directly saying We will not touch central bank digital currencies. This is not a central bank digital currency. We may or may not link it to stablecoin, but it's not a central bank digital currency. So to your point about monetary shifts going on, this is that moment in time, because we are seeing this move to digital, and we are also seeing a new type of digital currency war beginning to evolve. One based absolutely in a decentralized system, and the other actually a central bank digital currency, which is arguably very associated with a fiat currency.
Paul, actually, I'll throw another question to you to bring the audience in if you're not burning on this one. This is from Fatima, who's working in the government, and I think this goes to you, Paul. In light of growing geopolitical tensions and supply chain vulnerabilities, how might a shift towards domestic heavy industrial capacity enhance national resilience and reduce exposure to hostile trade partners or tariff shocks from unstable allies? Is this being considered or seriously explored by government? Whilst government has this heightened interest in emerging-ish tech like quantum and AI, I think in some ways it's almost related to the services versus manufacturing. Are we stronger one or the other? Your thoughts?
So I think we've all sort of learnt various lessons over the last decade on this. I think we saw it during COVID, of course, when we discovered the importance not just of having brilliant R&D, being able to scale and turn that into manufacture. And if one was to look at the war in Ukraine and the ongoing illegal Russian invasion, again, we can see it's not just a question of having technologies, but it's the ability to manufacture those at scale. Some of my colleagues talk about the combination of precision plus mass. This is no longer a trade-off between the two. It's having both those types of technologies within the system. Many of my teams are really interested in the question of manufacturing from a national security perspective. We're normally more niche and more focused than perhaps some of the really large-scale mass manufacturing used by my defence colleagues. But nonetheless, having the ability to turn those great ideas, those research breakthroughs into manufacturing is essential. And for me, manufacturing is also something that is often one of the things that keeps companies and firms sticky in the UK. We know that manufacturing requires a supply chain of talent, a supply chain of material, and once you've established a business delivering high-tech impact to customers, you're less likely to move something which is based on that type of model than perhaps something which is more ephemeral and digital. So there's a huge value to having that manufacturing chain in place. I think there's also a link between this and probably Rebecca's comments on currencies and emerging technologies. So the other thing manufacturing gives us is a real bedrock of support for how we tackle industry standards and international standards. When Rebecca was speaking, I was thinking that one of the points of continuity is, as technologies emerge, the way we regulate and understand them is usually by agreeing those international industry standards about how things are built, how things are operated. One of the big questions around central bank digital currencies is, how do you handle issues of privacy? How do you handle issues of the rights of citizens, law enforcement agencies, all those sorts of things? And I think as many people on this call will know, the way we handle that is by that combination usually of government and industry, particularly manufacturing, coming together to agree those rules of the road. We obviously need to do that faster and at more pace now. And as Rebecca noted, the range of technologies hitting the system is greater than ever before. But without that sort of depth of manufacturing at different levels, it's hard to have industry engaged and shaping the system in the way we'd really like to see, in a way that embeds our values in those type of industrial standards and keeps us secure. So there's a combination here that we really need that whole package. And going back to my earlier remarks about the importance of capital, the ability to grow manufacturing at scale invariably requires substantial resources that comes from those private capital flows. So it starts to come together as a story in a package that to be successful over a period, we do need that balance of R&D, pull through manufacturing, advanced growth. And certainly I've learned over the last few years the importance of manufacturing in moments of crisis, whether they be COVID or others.
Michael, can I just make a comment on that? I think the UK doesn't yet have a coherent industrial strategy, but what it does do is have what I think is quite an impressive AI strategy, which I think was launched by Matt Clifford and his partners a couple of months ago. And it's interesting because the UK has not followed the convention of the EU, which is kind of heavy regulatory framework, but when I looked at the recommendations, it's very, very clear as to what the steps and the stages are in terms of investment in AI and what's needed in terms of data centers and energy. So I think this is an early test case in two respects. One is the actual execution of the policy, and then the second is just attracting the financing.
Thank you. Michael, if I might, I'd like to turn to this. Angel Gaviera reminds us there's a big world out there. And it is intriguing when you look at it. We're talking about increasing our defense expenditure by percentages of GDP, which is quite interesting when I'd like to focus really not on expenditure, but on what we achieve. But let's go there. It's not a bad proxy at the moment. But suddenly we have no discussion of the developing world, and that was 0.7% of GDP. So Angel's asking us, is there any geopolitical space left to sponsor Bretton Woods version 2, where we could negotiate for a change ex ante to Rebecca's World War III, a new monetary and financing deal for the developed and the developing world? You know, is this the G7, the G20? Is it the BRICS? Or is this really a homegrown problem and we've got to solve it on our own?
So I think there is a part of the world that I'm very optimistic for. And we're going into what I would describe as a multipolar world, where you've got at least three big regions: China, the US, and Europe, who are big but will increasingly do things in a very different way. AI policy is a good example, and there is a potentially fourth pole. Maybe and the pinpoint of that is Abu Dhabi. So it's this greater region encompassing Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. I'm hoping we get peace across the Middle East, and that the greater region becomes part of this. And I think the Indian diaspora is incredibly important in this regard as well, not just linking India as an economy, but if you look at the number of Indians who live and work in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, etc., it's a sort of common thread through all these countries. And I think they will be the beneficiaries of trade wars between US, China, US, Europe, because it is a sort of a free trade zone where they strike free trade deals between, the Emirates and Ukraine on a Tuesday and the Emirates and Russia on a Wednesday. So there's very few strings attached. There's a lot of wealth and there's a lot of ambition in the region. Just talking to policymakers there, I've noticed recently a change in attitude in that they are now less keen to fund technologies in other countries, but more to build their own infrastructure. So I think if there was to be a new sort of part of the world that we could focus on, I think that's probably the more coherent one. I personally don't like the idea of the global south, because it doesn't pay enough respect to the complexity and diversity of countries from Indonesia to Nigeria. What I do know is that a lot of these countries are looking at different models now: the Chinese model, the European, the American model, and they're also looking at the wars in Ukraine and Israel, Gaza, Iran, and thinking, well, how do I protect myself? So those issues are very, very live in all of these big populous countries as well.
It's a very interesting pointer. I take note. Rebecca, a question here from Chris Wood. Is not part of the issue, I think is really interesting, kind of where things leaking, is not part of the issue in terms of reducing indebtedness, the fact that economic rent is not collected by the state?
So,
in other words, are we missing it?
Yeah. So I think there is a super interesting point in that. I was going to make a very quick point on Africa, because the quick point on Africa is that Africa itself is very conflicted between China and the United States. China has a huge amount of hegemony over infrastructures that are emerging in Africa. Africa is determined now. I talk to a lot of African banks, and they are very determined now to put in place not just venture capital, but actually working capital to fund trade for intra-African trade. So Africa is actually beginning to develop these types of frameworks for itself, and I think that is massive in terms of developing infrastructures for intra-African trade. Back to point on economic rent. I think we started to realise during COVID, I use the World Trade Organization's word for want of a better one, that everything was becoming fragmented, that we were beginning to have global supply chain crises, etc., etc. And COVID pointed out the weaknesses of the interdependent system that we have. But I remember running an event online over a couple of days with a huge number of people speaking. And one of the things that a lot of the political scientists and international relations and defence specialists said was, we are beginning to realise that autocracies are better at extracting economic rent and better at their relationships with business than we are in the democratic West. And we were talking about international rules-based orders. I don't think that word international rules-based order is appropriate anymore. We can't use that phrase because even the United States doesn't sign up to the phrase international rules-based order anymore, or the institutions of the state. So where are we actually seeing the major weakness in our market system? And this is why I say there is a systemic crisis going on. It's actually the benefits, the democratic benefits of free markets that allow the rent to be extracted by the commercial companies, that allow profitability to be made in the free market and resources to be allocated. It's fundamental. It's economics 101. Who actually allocates resources? Now, China and Russia would say we allocate resources and we have a relationship with our businesses to make sure that we keep control over that allocation of resources. So Russia at the moment is indebting itself, creating huge problems for itself in the future, but it doesn't care, by running a whole load of off-balance sheet guarantees for private sector lending. But it has control to do that because of its relationship with the private sector. We do not have, and this is something that was raised in your previous report, we do not have that type of social contract, if you like, that responsibility, that security responsibility between the state and the corporates to create some kind of security interest, national security interest in the democratic West, because we rely on the state not having control over those economic rents. And that, we have an opportunity if we start talking about economic security, and it's and just accepting the fact that we are in a very different world to the world we were in even 15 years ago or 20 years ago. So the world has changed dramatically. We have geopolitics, geoeconomics, geostrategic issues around us. If we acknowledge that, start talking about economic security, back to the point I made at the beginning, then there are new ways in which we can engage with business. We can say, this is a national security. Come talk to us about how we can share rent. Talk to us about how you supply working capital, because it's not all about venture capital, it's about working capital as well. Those are the key sets of conversations I think we need to start having.
Paul, you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, so I suppose my experience has been probably slightly more positive than that, Rebecca. So if I look at, say, the way we've developed the cybersecurity sector, that has very much been about a joint partnership between the private sector and government. It's involved schemes like the I-100 National Cybersecurity Centre approach, where volunteers come in from the private sector to work with government on various challenges. And in many other areas and technologies, we've been able to bring together that mission focus of companies who are interested in the same outcomes, whether that be trusted research or secure innovation, are interested in government as a customer of first resort, leading the way, giving assurance about particular types of technology, and are prepared to work with us in innovative ways to grow the sector. Now, I think we could make more of that. I think we could do more of that. But when we've really sort of put ourselves forwards, broken down some of the barriers, reduced some of the security issues that often got in the way of communication, I think the UK has demonstrated we can deliver the sorts of partnerships perhaps you're alluding to there.
And I wouldn't disagree with that. I really wouldn't disagree with that. Where the gap is the focus of this conversation, which is finance. So we engage venture capital, but there is still a problem with large-scale investments actually going to the United States in our innovative infrastructure. That is materially a problem. Venture capital, private equity itself accounts for a very small proportion of innovation. And I was having a conversation within government a couple of weeks ago, and they said one of the problems that we have is that we will only work with SMEs that have deep pockets. Right, if you're only going to work with SMEs that have deep pockets and the procurement system isn't going to change, then in actual fact, you've got a huge problem. You need to supply chain finance. It's very boring stuff, very technical stuff, forfeiting, contracts, invoice financing, all of these types of things, but actually working with the trade finance banks, because trade is in the middle of all of this. Trade and supply chain finance is working capital, and those organisations, this is a bit of a mission of mine, but those organisations aren't as involved as they should be. They will be soon.
I think we're in broad agreement there. Reducing the cost of finance, making procurement easier, music to my ears.
Yeah.
Well, as former master world trader, I believe that you're putting your finger on a very hot button there, Rebecca. You also gave me an opportunity to put in a small advertisement for a forthcoming report. Citiforum is putting out a report tomorrow on 2025 Finance for Security, Resilience, and Prosperity, written by David Finlay, and it is basically recapping a physical event that we all had at the BT Tower on the 14th of May. Lucas, Sasha, and the team will put that into the follow-up emails for everyone. Meanwhile, it's hard to hold a conversation like this together, and we've got just another 10 minutes of discussion, but I think I just ought to acknowledge where some of the audience would like to take us. JP McIntosh, how much of a shock would uninsurable real estate coupled with mortgage risk be in comparison with the 2007 problems? Nikki Holtzman would like to spend some time on a global disaster insurance fund. And these are all interesting and good threads that, in an ideal world, we'd have time. But I would like to move us into a question that James Berry raises about globalization. And I'm going to be directing this to you, Paul, in the first instance, and then perhaps Michael. We have seen this idea as Fatima was doing, and she'd also like us to look at what reforms would be needed to go into a reindustrialization area. We've seen this whole discussion about capital, and there is a very interesting argument that, frankly, capital is not the problem. Or certainly not overseas capital. You're not going to be bringing in millions of workers to do the work while Britons sit back on their backsides. It's going to be Britain's building roads. It's going to be Britain's building offices. We're just badly organized. And where you need foreign capital is actually where it's international, and also where you need skills in terms of understanding the risks of investments and how to manage them. So we've also seen in the United States this huge push under both administrations recently to bring back fabs, microchip processing plants and things to America, only to find out that Americans lack the skills to actually run those plants. They're all behind schedule and over budget, and that's despite working with TMSC. So James's question is, globalization destroyed human capital development, i.e. training, and he'd be very curious about how would you go about encouraging planning in this direction? Paul.
So I think we've touched on this in some previous events, Michael, and I think my view remains probably the same, which is traditionally, particularly on the national security and defence side of the house, we've often put the Department of Education to one side. That is, education, training, development of talent has not necessarily been seen as a national security problem. Now, whenever you look at any of our strategies, whether it be from the AI strategy, which Michael recommended, to the national quantum strategy, we always find that education, skills, talent is at the heart of it. But when we sit around a national security table, often education is missing from that position. So I'm really interested about how do we redefine our prism very slightly and start to see some of the vital policy enablers on that side of the house at the core of our long-term national security community. I'd be really interested to see how the conversation shifted, how the allocation of resources might be different if we made that shift. I think there's a bit of that in the national security strategy that's come out, but we could do a lot more. So I mean, there's a sense of how do we rethink what government is around this point. In terms of the practical measures, I think we're already seeing government coming together to try and bring together those technology strategies as part of the industrial strategy in a more coherent and consistent way. Understanding that some of the overlaps around how we grow STEM skills, how we do a postgraduate workforce are absolutely key. And then I think it's for the likes of the Treasury and others not to let any of the organisations I work for off the hook in terms of investing in the future and helping to grow the next generation of talent. They will both work within the agencies and national security community, but will also leave start companies, work across the system and form part of that wider grouping. But I think it starts with really seeing education and talent at the core of the national security challenge.
Michael?
Yeah, I disagree very strongly with the question. Globalization was a huge success because it raised billions of people out of poverty and into wealth. Look at Indonesia, China is a great example. There are two countries who didn't channel the benefits of globalization, the US and the UK. So in the UK, the benefits of globalization were concentrated in London. And the same in the US, in Silicon Valley and New York. And the point that proves that is if you look at the countries who are the most globalized, there's a sort of subset of 10 or 12 small, advanced open economies: Ireland, Sweden, Switzerland, Singapore. They have all used globalization to their own ends. They have very redistributive tax systems, and they invest heavily in education, training, apprenticeships. I mean, Switzerland is the best counterexample, and it's an example that the UK, I think, should look more carefully at. So globalization, I think, hasn't killed the local economy. It's just the way globalization has not been harnessed, I think.
Rebecca, did you want to make a comment on the effects of globalization on this debate?
I think it's incredibly interesting. Now this is going back, I was a very young researcher, 2005, and I went to a conference and the then chair or CEO of British Telecom said, it takes a dog, a chair and a computer to engage in the global workforce. And this is a wonderful thing. The dog to wake you up in the morning, the chair to sit down on, and the computer to connect with the rest of the world. And that meant that we were raising skills and skill levels all the way around the world. We had free movement of people, ideas, technologies, and so on around the world. I think Michael's right. We failed to capitalise on the benefits of learning ourselves from opening our labour markets out to other nations. And so we became a little bit complacent about the nature of our own skills development. But I want to point out one thing. If you look back to, now I'm really reaching into my economic history here, but if you reach back to around about 1871, there was a report that the UK government produced that said, we have a major skills shortage in this country. If we are going to industrialise at the pace that we need to industrialise, then we have this issue. Britain has always had this problem. We've always had a skills shortage. The problem comes with now using the policy levers, the financial levers that have been put into budgets. And I was at an event yesterday evening where participants from business were saying, we have a problem actually with the employers' levy on apprenticeships and things like that. We don't know where that money goes. We spend money on training people, but actually in the current climate, it's very difficult to do our own skills development. This is a moment in time, and therefore we have the opportunity to develop our own skills base and think about these things in the same way as we're thinking about finance, which is differently.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in? I'd heard the same story that Rebecca's began with about the dog, the man, and the computer. The version I heard how was the dog's role was to bark at the man she tried to touch the computer.
Yeah, that's right. Well, speaking of computers, we have time for just one last question and a very brief comment from you, Paul. Human, who is a PhD student specializing in financial crime, asks, former USSR states, particularly Russia, have influenced key UK hubs like London and our critical infrastructure through investments and also through security threats like cyber attacks. how should the UK rethink public spending and fiscal policies to address geopolitical influences?
I think I'd look to the recent legislative measures that have been taken, and I think a lot of the themes coming out of the national security strategy and strategic defence review, there's lots of, I think, recognition there of the variety of threats facing the UK and the need to use all the levers represented by the community on this call to reduce the threat from those sources.
Great. Right. Well, I'm going to turn to the panelists for a 1 minute closing remark in a second. It's been a wide-ranging conversation as we expected. We're hardly going to solve all of the crumbling infrastructure problems in one little webinar. That's certainly not the case, but the idea is to air the issues. However, one of the things that has particularly irked me over the recent periods has been government and the public seeking magic money trees and silver bullets. So we've got the magic money trees of if we just free up our solvency issues in insurance, Solvency II regulation, if we decide that we reallocate pension monies, hey, presto, the debt problem is gone. Equally, the government is enamored of whatever the flashiest new technology is, having discovered AI 2 years ago. Well done, well done. And it's this kind of seeking after something, and the public love it too, because I think it goes back to Christopher Messina's point very early on. Somebody else's problem, and it's just going to come in, Deus ex machina, magic pixie dust, if you will. So how do we get real about this? And that, I think, is kind of what I would appreciate all three of you having a go at. And I'll take you, if I may, in reverse order from the opening. Michael, may I start with you, because you've got this great historical perspective.
Yeah, and I just reflect that I've been party to some of the discussions on the Eurozone Savings and Investment Union, or the old Capital Markets Union. And it's the same debate. At a very top level, there's a demand for just releasing waves of money. When you dig into the underlying issues, it's a lot about intangible things like risk appetite, financial literacy, financial education, and also the financial education of the policymakers. I did a show of hands amongst European top civil servants in the finance area, and very few of them, for example, have ever invested in venture, private equity, or even public markets. So I think there needs to be a changing mentality, and maybe a changing narrative as well on the part of politicians, which I realize is very, very difficult to do.
Great. And then if I can turn to you, Paul.
I think something here about making it all of our challenges, and that requires understanding the leadership roles of each part of the community, whether that be government, providing certain types of leadership through the national security and defence community, the specialists in finance, through to private sectors and startups, plus the civil society voices on this call. But it's recognising those voices and who needs to be in the room to really turn some of the broader principles into actions, which could be much greater and delivered upon. I think that's the challenge we've got over the next 3 or 4 years.
And Rebecca.
Okay, 1 minute to talk without hesitation, repetition, or deviation on the subject of renewal. I think the main challenge that we have is mindset one. And so there is no magic money tree, we know that. But one of the problems that we have is, and I hear this from defence circles and I hear it from economic circles as well, we have institutions and structures that were built for peacetime and built for peacetime in the 20th century. We are in a very different world, and we need to think differently about that very different world that we're in. In other words, we need to think about economic security. We need to think about how we put our economy on a preparedness footing, and that doesn't create a magic money tree, because as Michael would say, we're already in huge amounts of debt, but it gives us new ways of dealing with that debt and new ways of raising money and new ways of creating institutions that are flexible to respond. I believe the government is getting there. The trade strategy, industrial strategy, strategic defence review, national security strategy, they all point in the right direction. It's time to stop talking about the economic growth and all of these types of things that are based on old macroeconomic models and start thinking about new ones, which is effectively revisiting some of our history, revisiting wartime economies. What do they look like and how did they generate growth? That's where we need to be.
Thank you. Well, in conclusion, if I may, I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been a good tour de force, good round the houses, and all three of you have been making excellent points, comments, and suggestions, and the thanks are flowing in on the screen here. So very much appreciated by the audience as well. I might say probably the biggest thing is to pull our socks up. Um, I think, Michael, you give us the historic sweep. These things can be fixed and need to be fixed and will be fixed. So that's good. And I would encourage us to look at what was mentioned earlier by you, Michael. I'm a big fan of the S8 nations, as my friend Jim Briding calls them, the small nations, the largest being the Netherlands with 17 million. That's higher than the Netherlands, Switzerland, obviously, Denmark, Sweden, Singapore, who outperform us on the things that matter, which is not GDP. It's about the quality of education, quality of healthcare, quality of the environment, infrastructure, and how we treat the elderly and the disadvantaged. Those are very clear measures. All that, I hasten to add, within a robust defense framework. So that is very, very important. And I think we should be doing that. And in fact, I often like to point out that my favorite politician in the world is, and I don't know their name, President of Switzerland. There you go. So the whole point being, if you don't know the name, it means the system is running and working itself. So a huge round of thanks to you, and we'll be sending all that and all the comments to you and to the audience. And just a short reminder that we have a number of forthcoming events, but not least tomorrow afternoon, David Doyle giving us his 6-monthly update on EU financial services regulation. Fascinating event to actually hear from Taiwan what's going on in Taiwan at the end of the month. And the first big webinar scheduled in September. There may be one or two during August as well, but environmental data meets financial risks, and we'll be looking at the topic, surprise, of AI. So there you go. But a big thanks to all of you for your contributions, and we look forward to seeing you at the next FS Club event.